I've complained and lamented over and over about there having been no consequences for all the wrongs done to us in recent years, wrongs inflicted by the leaders on the lead. Now I'm beginning to think differently. Just as the lies told to the populations about the so-called pandemic, about war in Ukraine, about war in the Middle East, about the climate, are so huge as to be paradoxically hard to see, similarly difficult to comprehend on account of their massive scale, might be the actual consequences right enough. And here I'm talking about consequences for the entirety of the West and its standing in the world. Back in 2022, senior EU politician Josep Borrell got himself into hot water when he declared Europe a garden and much of the rest of the world a jungle. He said, "We have built a garden. Everything works. It's the best combination of political freedom, economic prosperity and social cohesion that humankind has been able to build. The rest of the world is not exactly a garden. Most of the rest of the world is a jungle, and the jungle could invade the garden." End quote. From around the world came accusations that his words were racist and colonialist, but whatever Borrell's intentions were or weren't, like so much we in the West have been told in recent years, by 2024 his words sound utterly hollow anyway. Europe no longer feels like a garden, certainly not a well-tended garden. It feels neglected, it feels overgrown. If it's a garden, what's growing there now? And if the rest of the world is a jungle, there's a rumble in that so-called jungle. The response by the United States and NATO to the Russian response to the 8-year-old civil war in Ukraine was supposed to break the Russian bear. Kicked out of the international banking system called SWIFT, placed under the boot heel of sanctions, Russia was supposed to crumble, but events have been working out differently. The destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline was supposed to hurt Russia, but that action devastated Germany instead, and by extension has injured the rest of the European Union. Viktor Orban of Hungary has said of the US-led sanctions that they haven't shot Europe in the foot, but in the lungs. Economic reality has meant Russian oil, gas, grain, metals, real tangible things, commodities everyone needs and wants, have insulated Russia from any ill effects. By now, Russia has the 4th largest economy in the world, after China, the US and India, having in the year past leapfrogged ahead of Germany and Japan. This is what I mean about lies so big as to be hard to comprehend. This is what I mean about consequences every bit as massive. Which brings us to the BRICS, a rising reality, a growing group of countries dedicated to cooperating with one another for the purposes of trade. Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa are the founding nations of BRICS that give the letters of the acronym. Iran, the United Arab Emirates and Egypt have recently joined, and Saudi Arabia is flirting with membership as well. It's hard to know how much of a threat BRICS might pose to the US hegemony, now or in the future, but in terms of world trade, BRICS now accounts for 36% of global business, while the G7 nations can claim only 30%. The threat, economic or otherwise, posed by BRICS is hard to gauge, and for various reasons. Egypt is a recipient of a huge amount of US military support. The UAE and Saudi Arabia have thousands of US troops stationed in them. Geopolitical realities giving the US the potential for influence over the bloc. On one hand, those countries could be used as Trojan horses, giving the US leverage in BRICS from the inside. But it's also unwise to overlook another geopolitical reality. that long-term US allies can be seen to be looking for options and alternatives to the US. Now, why might that be? Well, it turns out that the decades of US foreign policy, dominated by neocons and manifesting in war, in sanctions and general bullying, has more and more of the world worrying, who's next? The vast majority of the world has bought and sold oil with petrodollars, a decades-old practice that has made the US dollar a necessity in every national pocket. But gradually, the US weaponised the dollar to such an extent that more and more countries feel they have no alternative but to find ways to avoid handling a currency that can so readily be used to do them harm. Vladimir Putin has talked recently at the latest BRICS conference in Kazan, in Russia, to name but one instance, about how dropping the dollar was not Russia's choice, but that it was forced out and left with no alternative.
You said that the dollar was used as a weapon. It is true, and we see that. I think it is a great mistake by those who do it, since the use of the dollar, which is still the most important tool in global finance, and its use as a political tool undermines trust in this currency, thereby reducing its capabilities. We are not the ones who do that, it's others. We are not rejecting the dollar or fighting against it, but if they don't let us work with it, what else should we do? We should seek other alternatives, and this is exactly what we do.
That's an interesting perspective, surely, that Putin's saying that he wouldn't have done it, he wouldn't have chosen to do it, but that without him having any options, he was left with no alternative. And now 95% of Russia's trade with other countries takes place, is done in other national currencies. So, as well as nations, including oil-rich nations, coming together as the BRICS, bricks in a wall, you might say, more and more of them are buying and selling oil and other commodities in their own currencies. This matters. This might matter hugely. At the same time, nations like Russia, China and India are repatriating their gold in vast quantities, bulldozing bullion and ingots into underground caverns, who knows. But they're getting it out of the US and Britain and wherever and taking it home. The Enbridge product is the name given to a growing alternative to the SWIFT system of international banking. The SWIFT system from which Russia was excluded at the start of the action in Ukraine. There's talk as well of a future currency backed by gold, a move that exposes another reality, that the US dollar and the rest of the fiat currencies are backed by, well, nothing at all. For all that the United Nations met recently in New York City to ratify its so-called Pact for the Future, binding willing members to all sorts, increasingly the United Nations is exposed as an empty vessel. It's supposed to bring about peace around the world, safety for all men, women and children. But when it calls for an end to what's happening in Gaza, as a for instance, it's simply ignored. President Maduro of Venezuela addressed the BRICS summit, and he was also addressing a sheepish-looking Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN. Watch the faces and listen to the words here.
I have had a conversation with UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Every missile that hits residential buildings in the Gaza Strip, wounded, killed in Beirut or in South Lebanon, these missiles destroy the United Nations. Where are the International Criminal Court? Or is it only being used to persecute Global South countries? Where is an international justice? Are they only there just to publish documents and communiques? How about life? The new world to be created is being born right as we speak, with BRICS being at the core of this new nascent world. This world would be built on humane principles. As I have said during our bilateral meetings with President Putin, the thing I said was, Venezuela belongs to the BRICS family. I thank you for the invitation extended to our country.
Even in translation, those words of Maduro's, they hit hard. Every missile that hits residential buildings in the Gaza Strip, wounded, killed or injured in South Lebanon, these missiles destroy the United Nations. They're irresistibly powerful words and they're hard to challenge. So for all its pontificating about the future of the world, who's actually listening to the UN? Who is taking that entity seriously any longer? And Maduro also talked about the rise of Nazi regimes. Who do you think he's referring to there? And he says, well, you know, the new world to be created is being born right as we speak, with BRICS being at the core. They talk about consequences for what's been happening in the West in recent years. Might the BRICS or something like it promise or foreshadow the end of Western and US dominance, the end of US hegemony in the world? Now, I'm not flying the flag for BRICS, and anyway, it's anyone's guess what the future of BRICS will be and who it will benefit. Many of those nations are anyway even further down the road towards the digital hellscape that I dread. Anyway, the slavery promised by a world of social credit scores and central bank digital currencies mandated this and mandated the other. I'm not holding BRICS up as the desirable alternative to what we've known in the West. I'm not calling for the downfall of the West either. But the events of the last 4 years and the decades before them are leading to consequences so big that they're hard to look at. It's surely indicative of the rumble in the jungle I mentioned before. I wonder too if what's happening in the West, to the West, including the torrents of cash flowing into Ukraine, apparently forever, I wonder if the harms being experienced in the West, in the United States, in Europe, I wonder if that harm isn't accidental, but deliberate. A deliberate dismantling of all we've known. And if that's the case, who's doing it? And whom does it serve? The EU is no garden, not anymore. Economic reality has already forced energy-hungry German companies to relocate to the US, so that the US is benefiting not from the supposed downfall of Putin's Russia, but from the crippling of the EU itself. The horror show of Ukraine, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians dead for nothing but profit, is unbearable to watch, and yet still it goes on. The horror show of Gaza is as hard to see, hard to watch. Here in the West, it's perhaps the dishonesty, the barefaced lying of our governments and leaders about the pandemic, about the war in Ukraine, and about so much more besides that has finally made the difference here. More and more people have abandoned the basic premise that our way of life is safe in the hands of those with power over our lives. More and more people are coming to see the West as, well, no longer what we were told it was, what it stood for, and how it went about the business of making that a reality. As I said at the top, I spent the longest time looking for consequences and not finding any. But now I realise the consequences are there right enough, which is to say that regardless of what we in the West might be being invited to be preoccupied with, while we see our currencies reduced to worthless paper, while we deny to each other the reality of gender, while our countries are deindustrialised and dismantled around us, while we wonder why we don't have national borders anymore, while our governments follow as though a Pied Piper the UN and the WHO calls for a new world order based on our slavery and our submission, net zero and Agenda 2030 and the rest, best described as a suicide note, vast swathes of the rest of the world may be seeing the world altogether differently, whether we've noticed or not. While all of our self-inflicted delusional nonsense plays out, other people in other places are, however reluctantly, turning their backs on the West and forging ahead with alternatives. I'm an avid consumer of the Jimmy Dore show online, and I'd invite you to listen to Jimmy, and more particularly his guest here.
They thought Russia was a lot weaker than they were.
Yes.
And they thought that Russia would collapse and they'd be able to balkanize it, break it up, and sell it off to BlackRock and Vanguard and State Street, just like they're doing to Ukraine right now, correct?
Yes, they absolutely believe that. That was a clear Biden foreign policy. I can remember Jen Psaki talking about the ruble being rubble, and I'm thinking, you're rubbish. When I was hearing her say this, they believe, the Biden administration believed that they could, during Biden's 4 years, crush Russia quickly in Ukraine, provoke them into this, crush their economy with sanctions that would lead to regime change in Russia. They could then, as you said, balkanize, divide up the country, then pivot hard to China and confront China hard, right, militarily, right, in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Straits, and ignore the Middle East, right? They thought they could ignore the Middle East would stay quiet. And as, British political philosopher said, events, my dear boy, events. Well, they didn't crush Russia. The Middle East didn't stay quiet. And they can't even pivot their head to China at this point because everything else on their foreign policy agenda has collapsed. There's this idea that, the dollar's dominance will seem inevitable. I mean, will seem, very hard to erode. It will seem indomitable. But the collapse may come very quickly. So some black swan event could trigger it to happen much more quickly. Similarly, in a further overreach, right, against another country of sanctions and cutting off from the financial architecture of the world, that could also facilitate it even faster. But it's still true that the majority of global trade is happening with the dollar. It's just less than before. And once this BRICS alternative to SWIFT comes online, that will help it process even faster.
So it's not just me. It's not just me looking on at the US and the West and Russia and the BRICS nations and wondering if there's an entirely different perspective that needs to be taken. You need to see the world through other eyes. Here's the thing. They told us we had a rules-based order, but it turns out there was only one set of rules, and much of the rest of the world, forced to follow those rules, is now busy finding ways to play another game entirely. Turns out the rest of the world might be going its own way, and that it will continue to do so unless the West pulls back from the brink, stops endlessly pursuing the same destructive policies. The scale and nature of the attendant consequences remain to be seen.